Hello, generations, young, old, and everyone in between. Welcome to Generation Apollo, where we're always running on the latest technology. And that's what I want to talk about today, the boomers and their love-hate relationship with technology. Now, many of us would say that it doesn't take a NASA engineer to see that there's more hate than love in that relationship, but I think that's because we're under the impression that boomers and most older folks generally hate technology, but that's not entirely true. You see, it's not that the boomers don't appreciate high-tech devices. They do appreciate them, but only when those devices make their lives easier and more convenient. When technology improves their lives, they support it. But if it doesn't improve their lives, or it creates inconveniences for them, then they view technology as a nuisance. And in the event that technology actually undermines the boomers' ability to control wealth and power, then they view that as a threat that must be regulated or even banned if need be. I'll give you guys a quick example. My dad's actually a perfect example of this. See, he's just barely computer literate. He doesn't even know how to send an email most of the time. Every time he's got to send an email, he's always asking me, hey, do I put the subject line here? Do I do this? And I'm like, yes, Dad, I've shown you like 50 times already how to do this. How is it that you still don't know how to do it? And he's just like, oh, I don't know. You just do it for me. So he sees sending an email as a chore, but yet on the opposite side, I should point out that he's a hoarder. He has a real penchant for buying things and spending money on things that he doesn't really need. So he managed to somehow figure out how to use Craigslist and eBay. He figured out how to set up an account with eBay, how to set up his payment information, and how to do all that. And yet, not once did he ever need my help to do that. But yet somehow he can't be motivated to learn how to send an email. But again, this is what highlights my point, is that the boomers are absolutely motivated to learn technology when there is a direct benefit for them in it. So as you can see, most boomers are not as tech averse as we have been led to think. After all, Bill Gates, the man who helped make the PC as ubiquitous in our homes as the television and the telephone, he's a boomer. And Steve Jobs, the innovative marketing genius that brought us the iMac, iPod, iPhone, and iTunes, was also a boomer. Clearly, these men saw the potential that tech had to change our lives. But was that change for the better? Well, that depends really on who benefited from those changes. You see, we tend to believe that the young are the ones who benefit most from new advancements in tech, but that's not always the case. People of all ages are now glued to their phones and other personal devices, but it's the younger crowds in particular who seem to be not only addicted to their devices, they are dependent on them. Take away their smartphones, and it's like you unplug their brains or something. And that's because they were raised on these devices. They've never experienced a world without them. Those who have experienced such a world are at least in a better position to disconnect from big tech. I myself was born in the early 1980s, so I know that I'm among the last of those old enough to remember what life was like before the internet and smartphones and emails and all that. I actually remember one time that happened a while back when I upgraded from an iPhone 4 to a 6, but my carrier royally fucked up the transfer process, and it wasn't until I got home that I realized my new phone wasn't working. But the Verizon store had closed, so I had to wait until the next day to go back and get the problem fixed. In the meantime, neither my new phone nor my old phone worked. I couldn't send or receive any calls or texts, and I only had internet if I was near a Wi-Fi hotspot. So I actually wasn't totally without my smartphone, but it did give me a bit of a taste of the life that I used to live before I had it. And at first, there was the slight anxiety of, what if I miss an important call or text? But eventually, as the hours went by, that faded because all I had to do was tell myself, hey, remember when you were in high school and this didn't exist? Oh, okay. All right, no problem. But that's how I coped with the temporary loss of my smartphone capabilities. Well, maybe I shouldn't say cope to say, that it was that big of a deal, but you get what I'm saying. The point is, that's how I was able to deal with it. If smartphones were to stop working tomorrow, it would definitely suck royally for a while, and I would definitely miss them, but I'm pretty sure that I would eventually be able to readjust to life without them again. But today's younger people, shoot, I can't imagine how they would handle that. But getting back to what I was originally talking about, sorry, I got a bit sidetracked there. The fact that the younger generations are hooked on smart devices to almost the same degree as a drug addict hooked on meth is a perfect example of how technology is being used against the young to the advantage of the older generations, particularly the boomers who want to control them. And that's why you'll never see anyone try to regulate or ban smartphones, even though we've seen how it can be used against younger generations in such a negative way. There's just too much money and power at stake. Plus, it keeps the young distracted. Again, to the advantage of the older generations who created and sold these devices to their children in the first place. And speaking of which, let's refer back to the godfathers of tech, Uncle Bill and Steve, for a relevant example. You see, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs sent their kids to elite private schools, not the public schools that you and I went to. They sent their kids to these special private schools where part of the curriculum was their access to tech and smart devices was strictly limited. Bill and Steve raised their children tech-free, or at least as tech-free as possible. Now let that sink in for a minute. These men made billions selling smart tech to your children, yet they decided that they didn't want their own kids exposed to it? Don't you think that raises some major red flags? What did they know that we don't? And folks, I want to point out that I'm not some Luddite. I'm certainly no Ted Kaczynski living in a shack in the middle of nowhere. I work in the IT field, so I'm exposed to tech every day as part of my job. I'm just saying that tech is a double-edged sword that can do great good or great harm depending on who's wielding that sword. Now, we've seen what happens when big tech is used to benefit the boomer elites. Now let's look at an example of what happens when technology is used against them. How many of you remember back around 2000 when Napster was making the news? I remember what buying music was like before the era of file sharing, for some of you much younger listeners. Back then, the only way to get music for free was to record songs onto cassettes off the radio. I actually remember doing that quite a few times, because if you liked a song on a particular album, you had no choice but to buy that entire album just to get the one song. And most CDs or most albums at that time typically cost around $20 to $25. Now, some stores did have demo stations where you could listen to certain songs and albums before you bought them, but not all stores did. And occasionally, if a song was popular enough to be available as a single, you could just buy the single for a little less. But again, that was also fairly rare. So when Napster came about, that was a great time for me because I was in high school and my family had just gotten a brand new computer with one of the first generation CD burners. But it was also the same time that my family finally got the internet in our home after resisting for the longest time. And we got cable internet, so I didn't have to trudge through the world of dial-up like many of my other friends did. I got the good shit right off the bat. Yeah, I know, I'm spoiled. But anyway, like I said, that was a great time for me because I was a high school kid with a CD burner, high-speed internet, and access to a shit ton of free music. For me, it was paradise. But for the boomer elites who controlled the major record companies, and still do, the rise of Napster was seen as anything but a paradise. I remember the backlash against Napster from the boomer-controlled corporate establishment, and they went after Napster hard because, at the time, record labels were rolling in money, and they realized the threat that it posed to their bottom line. They did get it shut down eventually because, we all knew that what Napster was doing was illegal. But as soon as they took down Napster, other file-sharing services like Kazaa, BearShare, and LimeWire that I remember using for the longest time, they quickly sprung up to take its place. And unlike Napster that relied on centralized servers, these other platforms used something called P2P, which means that everyone who connects to their network is both a client and a server, thus making these Napster copycats much harder to shut down. And it wasn't just music they were sharing movies, books, documents, software, you name it. Now, most of you probably think that the boomer elites gave up trying to fight file sharing because they realized that it was a losing battle. Wrong! They stopped resisting it only because they figured out how to use it to their advantage. Thanks to the marketing genius of Steve Jobs, a boomer, remember, he gave the world iTunes, which revolutionized how we buy music, movies, books, and all kinds of other online content. The boomer elites realized that it was better to embrace the file sharing revolution by pricing content just cheap enough so that it would be more convenient for people to buy than steal. From there, they can then go after the legitimate pirates without even breaking a sweat. Now, this is an example in which the boomers saw an emerging technology initially as a threat at first, but then changed their attitudes as soon as they figured out how to make it work for them. It's not that they gave up in the face of seemingly impossible odds. You need to realize that the boomer elites have very deep pockets, and the only thing that matters to them is winning, no matter what the cost. So, whenever they are presented with any kind of threat to their power, they will fight until the threat has been removed, or until they run out of money, whichever happens first. Seemingly impossible odds mean nothing to them. So, how would the boomer elites react when big tech backfires on them in such a way that there is no conceivable scenario in which they come out on top? Well, the 2016 election is a perfect example of that. Thanks to the influence of social media, the people voted in a way that the political establishment suffered a major defeat. We saw something happen that I thought I would never see happen in my lifetime. We saw an unconventional candidate, an outsider, win the highest elected office in the land. We saw grassroots efforts have tangible results regardless of not having access to multi-million-dollar or even billion-dollar corporate war chests. So whether you love or hate Trump, the important thing that his election has demonstrated is that it is possible for an outsider to beat the odds, provided that that person has a staggering amount of wealth and notoriety, of course. But also, on the Democrat side, we saw Bernie Sanders rise out of obscurity and nearly snatch the nomination away from the corporate shill Hillary, and he would have beat her if she didn't have the DNC already in her pocket. But the point is, grassroots efforts have finally gained traction. They had finally gained traction for the first time ever, and there is no denying that social media played a major role in making that happen. And that is why we're now seeing this assault on free speech. That's why there's a massive, organized effort to censor the internet and clean up social media. The boomer-owned corporate establishment knows that the only way they can make social media work in their favor is to have absolute control over it. Because if they can't get control, then they are screwed. That's why boomer elites are so enraged and acting with such ferocity, because this is the first time in history that the boomers have been denied something that they believe they are entitled to, that being absolute power. And to them, that is an egregious offense that must be remedied. And remember, as I said, that impossible odds mean nothing to the boomers. If I told you that the internet and social media would start censoring themselves, they would start censoring controversial opinions, many of you would have said, that's impossible, it'll never happen. But yet it is happening. First, they demonetized us. Then, when we moved to platforms like Patreon to make up for the loss of ad revenue, they pressured Patreon to ban us. Then, when we moved to competing Patreon-type platforms, they went after the payment processors like PayPal and even the big banks. They're trying to subvert the free market. That's how far they're willing to go. You thought that could never happen, but here we are. Like I said, impossible odds mean nothing to the boomer elites. They will keep throwing money at a problem until they get the results they want. If they can't get it to work for them, they will regulate it or ban it. So now, you've all seen how big tech is like fire. It can be used both against us and in our favor. That's why I firmly believe that technology will be our greatest weapon against the boomers, provided that we figure out how to do it first. I've been saying for a while now that if all the younger generations would use the tech that's in their pockets right now to its fullest potential, those generations would be unstoppable. If they started using these devices for fact-checking and actual research and not to play games or just watch cat videos, if they used those devices as weapons instead of toys, I'm certain that enough of them would become powerful enough or would wake up enough to be a threat to the boomer oligarchy. But a lot of them are still firmly under the boomers' mind control and have become their willing pawns. The question is whether enough will be able to wake up and rise to the occasion at the 11th hour and seize their future back from the jaws of the great Satan. Pray that I am right. And so, that concludes today's video. I hope that I've given you all something to think about. If you enjoyed this content, please leave a comment, subscribe, like, and share. And also, don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss a notification of a new video. And lastly, please be sure to follow me on BitChute. The link will be in the description. Thanks again for tuning in to Generation Apollo.